we're going to look at the peripheral nervous system next. The topics that we're going to cover are sensory receptors, nerves, the afferent and efferent lines of nerves, pain, and reflexes. Sensory receptors are what collects sensory stimuli, or collects the information from the world around us. And so sensory receptors are involved in both sensation and perception. So sensation is the kind of our awareness of a stimulus, and perception is understanding what the stimulus is. Sensory receptors are classified in 3 different ways. They're either classified by stimulus type, by location, or by structure. When looking at stimulus type, there's 5 different breakdowns. So mechanoreceptors are the ones that we think of probably most often: touch, pressure, vibration, and stretch. There are also thermoreceptors, which sense temperature, photoreceptors that sense light, chemoreceptors, and so we see chemo as chemical, so chemoreceptors sense different chemicals that inform smell, taste, and blood chemistry. The last type of stimulus is pain, so those are nociceptors, and so nociceptors sense extreme temperatures, extreme pressures, and inflammatory chemicals. So just to hit temperature, thermoreceptors sense temperature within comfortable ranges. And once you get to the extremes, whether it's too cold or too hot, that's sensed by nociceptors. And you can kind of feel that, right? When you're really cold, it is painful. But when you're just a little chilly, that's not pain, it's just a little discomfort. The next classification is looking at location. So we have exteroceptors, and exteroceptors are taking information in from the outside world. So most of these are found in your skin, and this is, for touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. Your eyes are also have exteroceptors, right, taking in visual information, ears, auditory information, etc. Then we have our interoceptors, and interoceptors are also called visceroceptors, and they are found in the organs, otherwise known as the viscera, and vessels of the body. They can sense chemical changes, they can sense tissue stretch, and they can sense temperature changes. Generally, we're not consciously aware of what's happening in our viscera unless things have gone really poorly. So we don't have much conscious awareness of the information that interoceptors are taking in. And the last location-based classification are proprioceptors. Proprioceptors are responding to stretch in skeletal muscles, tendons, joints, ligaments, connective tissue that covers the bones and the muscles. And so proprioceptors bring in information to our brain that allow our brain to understand where our body is in space, and that information is then used to coordinate movements. And the last classification structure is the structure of the receptors. So some receptors are just the dendritic ends of a neuron, okay? And so those are just like we've seen when we were studying the structure of a basic neuron, just those little branches. And so those types of receptors are found throughout the body. They monitor most sensory information, and they can be free, like we see over here, or they can be encapsulated, like we see over here. And then the other type we have are sensory cells, and sensory cells are found in areas where we have special senses, so like within eyes, within ears, so within those sensory organs. And so we can see over here, we have a sensory cell here, and a sensory cell here with little processes that are, this is found in the ear, right? Because these little hairs are going to be part of understanding the sound that's coming in. I should just take a second to talk about the encapsulated dendritic endings. So over here, we can see right away that this is a Pacinian corpuscle, and the kind of multiple layers are a capsule of connective tissue, just so you know what it's encapsulated with. So let's look at sensory processing for a little bit. So we're getting this information coming in, but we need to know what to do with that information, right? And so this is going to be kind of covering the jobs of the somatosensory system, the system where the information that's coming in gets processed, mostly in our parietal lobe, and then our brain can figure out what to do with it. So it's going to start at the receptor level, okay? And that's what we've been talking about. This is where we have receptors that are, sensing a stimulus. And so when it has to be a significant enough stimulus to cause a change in the receptor. And so that's called like the receptive field. From there, it's going to cause a graded potential, and enough graded potentials can lead to an action potential. One thing that's important to think about here, though, is that if a receptor is getting a constant stimulus, it might become adapted to that stimulus. It might stop sending a message. Okay, and so this happens with smell. You'll walk into a room and you smell something awful and you're like, oh my gosh, I can never be in here. But if you stay in the room for a few minutes, you don't notice it so much, and that's because your chemoreceptors have adapted to that smell and they're no longer giving your brain that message. From the receptor level, it goes to the circuit level. So this circuit level is part of the ascending pathway. And so we have the neurons that send messages from the receptors to the spinal cord. And so that's called a first order sensory neuron. Okay. Sometimes information is going to just go straight out of the spinal cord there, but not always. If it continues to go up to the brain, it's going to the second and third order neurons. And the third order neurons are found in the thalamus, and they're going to send information to whichever part of the somatosensory cortex that information is supposed to go to. The perceptual level is processing that information that's coming in. So how do you interpret what that information is telling you? And so this is going to all happen in the cerebral cortex, and mostly in the parietal lobe of the brain. When we're talking about perception, there's a bunch of different kind of types of perception. So magnitude of a stimulus, the kind of spatial discrimination where the stimulus is coming from, any kind of features of the stimulus, patterns, those types of things. So there's a lot that goes into that perceptual level. It's kind of merging all that information so you can make sense of it. So we've been talking about the parts of a nerve, but we haven't really talked all that much about what a nerve is, other than briefly going over the structures in lab. And so I'm not going to go over the different layers once again, because we did cover those in lab. But I am going to cover kind of some of the information about nerves that we haven't hit. So there are 3 different types of nerves. A nerve may be purely sensory, which means that all the axons in the bundle are going to be sending information up to the brain, up that afferent pathway. All of the cell bodies are going to be in this dorsal root ganglion. So that's one type of nerve. And then there are motor nerves. Motor nerves are efferent, so sending messages from the brain and spinal cord out. Okay, and so these are going to come out of the ventral root. So motor information comes out of the ventral root. And see, the dorsal root and the ventral root meet right here. And this little area right here is called a spinal nerve. Okay, a spinal nerve is where that dorsal root and ventral root meet. Okay, and if you follow these pathways, you can see that sometimes motor information is going to go out the dorsal ramus, and sometimes sensory information is going to come up the ventral ramus. So this is the part that is specialized. Okay, the dorsal and ventral roots. After the spinal nerve, you're going to have the opportunity to have mixed information going in and out. Okay, and that's a perfect segue to our, well, almost perfect segue to our mixed nerves. I should talk about the cell bodies of motor nerves first. So there's many cell bodies in the gray matter of the spinal cord for motor nerves. There's some cell bodies that are found in ganglia along the spinal cord, and that's part of the autonomic nervous system. We see those ganglia along the spinal cord, and then it's adjacent to, not within the spinal cord. And then near the effectors, near visceral organs, again, these would be autonomic ganglia that we find near those organs. So the third type of nerve we have are the mixed nerves. And so mixed nerves have both afferent and efferent axons, right, pathways, and those paths are going to split at the spinal nerve. So here we have a mixed nerve, and the sensory information is going to go into the dorsal root, and the motor information is going to go out the ventral root. One thing it's important to mention about neurons and nerves is that once you have a mature neuron, it's not going to divide, okay? They're amitotic. And so this means different things for different places. Within the central nervous system, if you have a damaged axon in the central nervous system, it's really unlikely that that axon is going to be able to heal itself or regenerate. The oligodendrocytes that surround those axons actually secrete growth-inhibiting proteins that stop regeneration within the central nervous system. And so what's going to happen is astrocytes that are in that area are going to form scar tissue. In the peripheral nervous system, the axons can regenerate sometimes, okay, if the damage isn't too bad. And so the axon fragments that are left after injury are going to break down. Macrophages are going to come in and clean out all the debris. And Schwann cells, those Schwann cells, remember, they make the myelin sheath, are going to start dividing. And they form what's called a regeneration tube. Within that regeneration tube, we're going to get the new axon filaments growing, and you end up with a new axon with myelin sheath wrapping around it. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into motor nerves. And so we've talked about the receptive ends of nerves and a little bit about what happens at a synapse, but I'm going to talk more about what happens at the end of a motor nerve, how it passes that information on to a muscle or an organ. And so if we're passing information on to a muscle, that's going to be a somatic nerve. Somatic means muscle. And it's going to release acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is going to bind to receptors on a muscle cell and cause movements of sodium and potassium across the membrane. And so if you remember, I mentioned that neurons and muscle cells are very, very similar, except for muscle cells can contract. So it's a very similar process. If a graded potential reaches the threshold for a muscle cell, it's going to cause a muscle contraction. One thing I should say is that a graded potential, when we're talking about a muscle cell, is actually called an end plate potential. And so that end plate potential can result in an action potential, which leads to a muscle contraction. When we're looking at the visceral nerves are going to tell organs what to do. they're going to release acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and they are a slower responding nerve, or the organs are slower to respond to those nerves. So acetylcholine and norepinephrine in this case act as a second messenger. And I just want you to kind of hold that in the back of your head. We're going to talk about second messengers when we study the endocrine system. And so you'll have a better understanding of what I mean when I say a second messenger. What I want you to know right now, though, is that visceral nerves are going to release acetylcholine and norepinephrine, and there's a slower response than there is for somatic nerves. So, how are motor movements controlled? We're going to start at the segmental level. And so the segmental level is kind of like the most basic control. And so it's going to control kind of repetitive motor activities. And these are called central pattern generators. And these activities are going to be controlled by both inhibitory and excitatory neurons that are going to produce these rhythmic or alternating motions, which are also called reflexes. The next level is the projection level. Okay, the projection level has direct control over the spinal cord and acts on both direct and indirect motor pathways. And so there's upper motor neurons that produce voluntary movement of skeletal muscles. There's also there's motor nuclei deep in the brainstem that help control reflexes, and it also helps to control the central pattern generator motor actions. Okay, the highest level of control is the pre-command level. And so the pre-command level includes the cerebellum and the basal nuclei. And so remember, the cerebellum kind of coordinates and smooths out motor commands, and the basal nuclei is going to be doing similar things. So the basal nuclei is going to get information from the cortex, and then it's going to send information back out to the premotor and prefrontal cortices through the thalamus. So when we're looking at control, again, the segmental level is very, very basic. It's looking at these central pattern generators, these very repetitive movements. The next level is going to be the projection level. It's a little bit more detailed, a little more control. And then the pre-command level is, again, the highest form of control that we have for motor. We're going to wrap up this chapter by looking at pain and reflexes. Pain is a super important sense, right? It warns us that we're about to really cause some serious damage, or it tells us that some serious damage has occurred. So that information may be coming from external stimuli, from extreme pressure, extreme temperature, or it might be coming from chemicals that our tissue releases because of damage, like histamine, potassium, ATP, acids, and bradykinins. When that type of stimulus comes in, the sensory neuron that sends that information into our central nervous system is going to release glutamate and substance P. So these are the pain neurotransmitters. Pain has a threshold, just like all action potentials have a threshold. And so we all have the same pain threshold, right? At a certain point, our neuron is going to send a signal saying, hey, you're in pain. Okay, so sending that action potential is a result of our pain threshold. Our experience of pain is different based on our bodies, our genetics, what have you. And so that is pain tolerance. So we all have the same pain threshold when we experience pain, but how we experience that pain is our pain tolerance. And again, that's heavily weighted on genetics, but also personal experience. Most of the pain we think of is pain that we have in our muscles, our joints, our skin, but there's also visceral pain. And visceral pain is a different kind of pain. And this is when receptors in our visceral organs sense extreme tissue stretch, ischemia, which is when blood is not getting to the tissues, chemicals released by damaged tissues, muscle spasms. All of these things will trigger a stimuli that, tell our bodies that we're experiencing pain in these organs. This is experienced by kind of like an gnawing, aching, burning feeling. And, it can also be stabbing, like when you have appendicitis, that tends to be a really sharp pain. So the tricky thing with visceral pain is that there's kind of so many like highways essentially that those neurons travel on. So there'll be, there's many branches that come together, and sometimes they separate again and come back together. And so sometimes a signal gets crossed, and so you think that you're experiencing pain in a different area than the pain is actually coming from. And that's called referred pain, when a body region is perceived to be experiencing the pain, but it's actually coming from a different region. And so, the appendix is a good example. Sometimes people will have pain on their left side, even though their appendix is on their right. A heart attack is another example. People experience left arm pain, but that pain is actually coming from the damaged tissue in the heart rather than the left arm. And last but not least, we have reflexes. So reflexes can be intrinsic, which means something that you're born with. So like a baby rooting for a nipple when its cheek is rubbed, or a baby grasping for your finger, or acquired, which is something that you learn, like driving becomes a reflex. And then they can either be somatic or visceral. So when we go to the doctor's office and they whack our knee with the reflex hammer, at the patellar ligament, hopefully they're not actually hitting your patella. And that is a somatic reflex, right? It's dealing with the muscles. And a visceral reflex, just like all these visceral things we've been talking about, would be dealing with the internal organs. Okay, so an example of a visceral reflex is smelling food and, all of a sudden your mouth fills up with saliva. When we talk about reflexes, we talk about the process as being a part of a reflex arc. And the steps of a reflex arc sound similar to the steps of a negative feedback, but they are not the same things. Okay? So a reflex arc is going to have a receptor. It's the site where the stimulus is coming in. That information is going to go up through a sensory neuron, through that afferent pathway, to the integration center. And so the integration center is within the central nervous system. Often it's in the spinal cord for many of these reflexes, but it can also be in the brain. And a reflex can be either monosynaptic or polysynaptic. So if it's a monosynaptic reflex, from that sensory neuron is going to send a stimulus directly to a motor neuron. And then that motor neuron is going to cause an effect, either contraction of a muscle or of a gland or organ. Or the sensory neuron is going to meet an interneuron and then go to a motor neuron. So the interneuron would be kind of the middle person. And so now we have more than one synapse, and so we have a polysynaptic reflex. From the integration center, it's going to send information out to the motor neuron, and then causing a change in the effector. So let's just go through this a little bit with that knee example. So the patellar tendon is hit by the reflex hammer. That causes the tendon to stretch. That stretch signal is going to go up into the spinal cord. It's going to be processed very quickly and go down a motor neuron and cause the quadriceps muscle to contract, making our leg kick out. There's quite a few reflexes that we talk about in our lab activities, so you'll see more there. It's not a bad idea to read through the notes and the lab manual just to kind of get an idea of some of the other reflexes that our body has. Okay, if you have any questions, please post to the community help forum. As usual, I hope this video was helpful for you, and I will see you soon.